Cool. So still, I know we've done this before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself a little bit of your background and where you come from for the audience?
Yeah. Well, my background is I am a what am I? Yeah, I'm an Australian who has a Swedish passport for the convenience of being able to travel throughout the world, especially in the 80s and 90s when I first went to Europe. So my parents were Swedish, so it made it much easier to have a Swedish passport. I married a Swedish high jumper, and so that's why I sort of stuck around in Europe. Plus the fact that track and field is much bigger in Europe. So I was an athlete. I was a decathlete myself, mostly injured, but every once in a while I did some decent results. Got into coaching because I had a lot of injuries, and my coach thought that I would become a good coach. So he wanted me to do coaching courses, which I did all over Europe. That's how I got started. And then when I retired, I suppose you could call it, from high performance competing myself at the age of 34, 35, after having 2 years that I actually wasn't injured, but I was only pole vaulting then, which was one of my better events. I decided to call it quits and went into coaching more or less full time. I had a high performance gym in Sweden, and that's how I got into hockey, because I started getting a lot of hockey players coming in, and I did a lot of measurements with the technology that was available, and then I invested in new technology, and that way I got in contact with Muscle Lab, which is a Norwegian product, in the late 90s when they were just coming out, and I still use that system to this day. It has some very unique metrics. So with that system, I had EMG testing, I had a force plate, and I had the encoder, so I could measure what was going on a bar in the gym. I also had infrared 2 tracks, which are about 1 meter long, so I could do I could test, for example, ground contact times from different jump heights and so forth, and that gave me the sort of like what normally maybe 10 years earlier was the exclusive rights or the domain of a high performance test center biomechanics lab, was all of a sudden available for about $16,000 US, which was then still a lot of money, and it's still a lot of money even today. But what it did was it opened up Pandora's box, because all of a sudden a colleague of mine who had also bought a system same as mine, we could all of a sudden start measuring things that we'd only sort of maybe read some articles that was coming out of high performance test centers with $1 million budgets and that sort of thing, and we could start doing things. So we started measuring a lot of things, and just sort of attacking our own beliefs about what we were doing, and what other people, when we were doing education for ourselves, that other people were saying, oh, this is the way it is. And we'd go home and we'd do some tests and find out, no, that's not at all what happens. So that's how I got into technology, was to sort of challenge what I was doing and what people were telling me was the right thing. Because if you've got a machine that measures empiric data, then it's difficult to argue against. It's not me saying, this is what you should do. It's empiric data that's coming up, that's by validated machinery and systems that is being used in high performance facilities and university and research facilities all around the world. So it made things it made sense to sort of go down that path. And then I worked for many years in track and field, but also in professional ice hockey, which I those colleagues that still work with some of the big teams in Sweden. Football. So I got into football. I tested Everton as well, 2015. And then Randy Huntington, who I've known for many years, chased me down and said that he wanted me to come to China, and said that there were some opportunities to do some interesting stuff over there. And that was in 2016. And I've sort of been bouncing back and forth in Asia now since 2016. So I've been in China in 2 different periods, and now I'm in Hong Kong, China. So yeah. And as a side note, I'm the original founder and the inventor of the 1080 technology. For those who know what that is, so I'm the nutcase that came up with the idea from the first day, so to speak. So the first company that started the whole journey with the building of the prototype until we had the quantum system, which is the 2 big towers, until that was finished. And then in 2015, we launched the Sprint. Randy was one of the first customers. And I went over to him in Beijing with the first 1080 Sprint. And I think that's where we sort of started hatching the plan that I was going to come over and join him. So that's a little bit quick what I do. Today I work at the Hong Kong Sports Institute, and I also have one of Australia's fastest sprinters that I coach. We've run 10:11 and 20:59 so far. So we're hoping that he's going to run a bit faster. That's the ultimate goal anyway. So a little quick recap on who I am and what I do.
Nice. That's quite a journey. So how, do you think that there's a cultural difference between training in Europe or training athlete in Asia, China?
Well, China's a very is there a difference in coaching Asian athletes and let's say non-Asian athletes, and is there a difference in Asia? Well, there's a difference between Hong Kong and China, and there is a very big difference in coaching athletes from China rather than in, let's say, Europe. There are cultural differences. I think the biggest difference that is really makes it a big battle in China is that very few athletes speak English. Here in Hong Kong, everybody speaks English. So you don't need translators, which has always been a problem in China, because the translators are taking virtually, for example, in Beijing, they came out of the Beijing Sports University. And you would think that if they were going to have interpreters for the national coaches, the foreign coach is the national coach, that they would pick somebody who's done something in sports, maybe sports science or sports management or something in that area. What usually happens is it's somebody who's actually done economics, or it could even be languages. So that person, and that's happened to us several times, has no background in sports. And the problem then is that when you're dealing with we're working at the national level with the national team. So we've got athletes that have won world championships and made Olympic finals, set Asian records. So we're talking results in the absolute top of track and field. So that means we're not talking sort of, you know, if we're talking motors, we're not talking about a lawnmower, we're talking about a Formula One car. So these people have got no understanding of what we're actually saying. So we'll say something to them, blah, 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 blah. They translate it, and you can immediately see on the response of the athlete what we said and what they were told are two completely different things. So usually what we say is that in China, everything takes 3 times as long. So if it was to, you know, if we thought we're going to do something in 1 year, let's say in Europe or in the US or in Australia, it would take 3 years in China. And it's not because people don't understand. It's simply because, well, it is, but it's not that, you know, they're you know, in any way less intelligent. It's just that there is such a language barrier that it's just impossible. That problem we don't have in Hong Kong. The plus side, of course, to China is you've got a population of 1.3 billion. You've got plenty of talents. In Hong Kong, you've got what? Is it 10, 12, 14 million? Something like that. I mean, this is the whole of Hong Kong is about a third of the size of Beijing. So that means that just in Beijing alone, I've got 3 times the population of the whole of Hong Kong. And then I've got the rest of China to, you know, pull athletes from. So the resource pool of talent is so much bigger. I think that's probably the big things. And there are differences as well. Asian athletes tend to be more elastic than Western athletes. With Western athletes, we need to build elasticity. In Chinese athletes, it's virtually, or Asian athletes, it's usually something that you don't have to worry about because they are extremely elastic. So we've got to build other bits and pieces. But elasticity, they have naturally, which makes it easier, especially on a sport like track and field, which is very, very dependent on elasticity. I mean, one of the biggest negative influences on the capability of running fast is your repositioning ability. How fast can you get the wheel around to get ready to go boom back into the ground? Now, if you've got bad elasticity, you can't get the wheel around quick enough, then you're just not in a position early enough to be able to strike the ground in that vertical position when you're, for example, at max velocity. So that means that you might have genetics that are very good, but your elasticity is not allowing you to get the foot around to a position where you can attack the ground again.
Nice.
So then the elasticity becomes a limiting factor to your speed development.
Nice. So I want to pick up from what we discussed about last time about like you mentioned like lunges with some rotation, and I noticed that some of like the coaches, no matter in Europe or in Asia, they're doing some movements with it's sort of like lunges instead of like landing the hip, they lift their knee and call it like hip lock, and it's sort of like kind of like what we discussed last time about like spinal injury theory. So can you like discuss a little bit more or tell us a little bit more about like how you program the lunges with like sprint training or sprinters?
Yeah, I mean, the thinking behind that is that, for example, if we do a lunge, we'll lunge out. We can either just do them in a straight line the whole time, and we'll build, let's say, linear capacity. In other words, staying nice and rigid in that position and walking forward. We'll also do reverse lunges. They're also an excellent way of training the hamstrings. When you incorporate a rotation or a lateral movement. And the idea behind that is that, for example, if you are, for example, a long jumper or a high jumper, you're going to jump off 1 foot. So let's say you're a high jumper and you're coming from the right. You've got a curved approach, so the centrifugal force, it wants to throw you against the mat. So you've got to get the right side to stay away. So if in that case, if I do a lunge, I'll do lateral flexion and a little bit of rotation so that they learn how to resist collapsing on this case on that right hip. So if they're in a position where the hips are coming in, they're on the curve, so that this right hip doesn't do that, because then it's going to start signaling immediately that let's go to the bar, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep it in that position, and if it does sag, it only sags to the horizontal, and then from there we can go vertical. So these movements, for example, where you incorporate flexion side to side or a little bit of rotation, is to help and to train the swing side, the non-jumping side, to not collapse at takeoff. And it's just as imperative in long jump as it is in high jump. It's more because you're going directly vertical. In long jump, you're jumping out at about 26 degrees, 28 degree angle. So it's not as severe. But at the same time, you've got much higher velocity in the long jump. So it becomes imperative to have very, very good hip stability and core stability in that position. So that's the...
Yeah, go on, please.
Yeah, no.
So when programming these movements, is there like certain like hip position you can be looking at?
Yeah, we do. From time to time, it depends, what you see. It's sometimes I do these things. We do, for example, we do step ups from different heights, which is a big part of our programming. It has to do with how fast you accelerate the weights. If you're doing a short movement, which is when you land on your takeoff leg in long jump or high jump, you've got minimal flexion at the knee. So you're trying to utilize a straight lever. It will bend, and it should bend at the knee, but you're going to try to conserve as much elastic energy into that system to propel you either straight up or slightly forward. So in saying that, we do, for example, step ups from different positions, but we also do what we call step down. So you're actually doing a step up, but you're actually stepping down on, let's say, on the right, and the left will then step onto maybe a 10 or 15 or 20 centimeter high box. So roughly it would mean that your right hip would go down, and then you would be lifting your left leg, you'd hit the box, and then you'd push the right hip to that position. So you're more or less tilting your hip in that position by stepping on the side of a box rather than stepping straight forward on the box, where then both hips are going to come up virtually. Well, you've got one on top of the other, but it's much more pronounced if you're doing it on the side. So we call that a step down, and it works a little bit the same way because it's going to do lateral flexion, and that helps when it comes to the stability.
Nice. And does that also, because it helps with the stability, so does that also help with like power output?
Yeah, I mean, a big thing, we were discussing that actually today, and if for example, if you're talking about starts for sprinters, it's not about how much force you can apply to the ground. It's how you do it. So if you are very good technically and apply force so that you're actually being projected forward horizontally rather than producing, what usually happens is there's a lot of funny things that happen coming out of the blocks, and that first leg, it tends to be too stiff. The whole system is just too stiff. There's just not just ankle stiffness, there's this idea that you jam your foot into the ground, and that, of course, then causes the whole system to go vertical. So virtually the sprinter doesn't come up like a jumbo jet over a long takeoff, which is what the acceleration should look like. It should be like that until you got. Instead, it's boom. They're virtually straight up after 2 steps, which means there is no acceleration phase to talk about it. It's virtually 2 steps and it's into max velocity phase. So you've got to run sort of like 96 meters at max velocity. Well, good luck with that. So it's in track and field. It's all about positions. If you're in the right position, you don't necessarily need to be able to put massive amounts of force into the ground. It's nice if you can, because it's going to be you're going to do a better performance, but you can do some pretty big performances by being able to exert force in the right time, in timing and with rhythm, rather than massive amounts of force in the wrong position without rhythm and without elasticity.
Nice. So I'm gonna jump out the question list. A few days ago, I talked with Lawrence Seagrave about like sprinting acceleration, and what he said is like triple extension should never happen when athletes do like when sprinters do acceleration, and it's sort of like what you just mentioned. It's not just about like power output; it's more about the position.
Mm.
So is it? Am I understanding it the right way? Is it kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I think what Lauren's probably referring to is, for example, a lot of people think at push off, the leg should be the back leg should be absolutely straight, but it's not. The ideal position, and if you look at a slow motion video of the best sprinters in the world, they have a little bit of flexion in the knee, and that is to keep that elasticity built up there. And they also want to get the heel coming straight back up and just get going straight up to the top of the hamstring. Top of the hamstring. So you don't want the foot to do an arc at the back of the body. So if you're looking at a sprinter that's moving from in this case from here to here, then the way his leg is doing a circular motion, and let's say that the pen is his body here. Now, if the circle is back here, let's see if I can do it better. If the circle is back here, so you've got a big posterior circle and you've got a small wheel at the front, this is not going to drive you very much at all. What you want is a quick recovery here and a big wheel here, because this is where you can apply force to the ground, not back here. This is all about recovery. So here we want to get in a position where we want to get that foot or heel coming back as fast as possible, up and then forward. So I think that's what Lauren was talking about. Plus the fact that when you get to the speeds some of these guys are running, they're running at 12 meters per second. So they're in the ground 80 milliseconds. So you really don't have time to do triple extension. Everything is happening so quickly. It's like a rubber band just going, and it really doesn't ever flex to its full length. It's flexing enough to get elasticity to get the system from here to here as fast as possible, so I can hit the ground again. Nice. And that's the mistake that a lot of times, for example, I can remember back in my career, and I was taught the wrong way to run fast. I was taught to push, and I became a pusher, and I realized very late in my career that I could generate very quick, and I had pretty good turnover. And if I would have learned to apply force this way rather than that way, I probably would have run a lot faster than what I did. So I couldn't utilize what I was good at doing because I was trying to do something completely different.
Nice. So I'm sorry I put you in a hard position again. Sorry about that. So next thing I want to discuss is like the six week block you mentioned last time about like 2 weeks
Yeah,
of accumulation and a week of recovery. Then after that is 2 weeks of intensification and 1 week of
yeah.
recovery. So can you like give us some thoughts or some example about like what is the weekly layout when it comes to like accumulation and the weekly layout of like intensification?
The actual weekly sort of layout, as far as you say, what we do on given days is virtually the same. What shifts a great deal is the actual exercises and for example, that we do in the gym. To give you an idea, what we would normally, let's say, if we start off at the start of the year, then a typical thing would be doing cleans from the floor. We will do high box step-ups and we'll do some parallel squats, for example. Now, that we'll do for 2 weeks. We'll have a recovery week, and then we'll do 2 weeks of intensification. Well, what does the intensification mean? Well, that means that for example, we'll go to hang cleans, because it's a shorter range of motion. So you've got a shorter pull on the bar, which means you've got to accelerate it quicker. So we're using the same amount of weight, but I've shortened the amount of time that you've got to pull. So that means you've got to accelerate faster to get the bar up and around. We'll do quarter squats, box squats, for example. Again, it's a shorter movement, so we can have a higher acceleration. And then if we then go, let's say, another phase forward and we get to accumulation, well, then what was intensification in that first block of 6 weeks, in this case, the first intensification, that will become the next phase accumulation. And then there's a progression in the next phase of the intensification, which means, for example, it might go from hang cleans to drop cleans. In other words, we're going to move the weight slightly eccentrically fast, and then start pulling. And then we will, for example, do box squats. We'll change those out to step-ups. And we'll do, for example, 25 centimeter step-ups. So therefore, we've moved the force velocity curve to the left. So the acceleration curve has gone from being flat to being more accelerated.
So,
and that's how the progression goes throughout the whole cycle.
nice. So that's things in the weight room. But when it comes, how about things in the track field, or like when you train like sprinters? And when do you do like accumulation and intensification?
Yeah.
Does that like changes like how you sprint the volume?
Yeah, for example, if you look at sort of acceleration is what I call sprint activation. That's our acceleration session. It can be used as an activation, potentiation. That's a technical session as well. And we'll do, for example, speed bounds. We'll do straight leg runs, and we'll do an acceleration, and then we'll do we'll do those 3 exercises, or sometimes we'll do, for example, with the 1080 sprint, we'll do another acceleration, but with a resistance. Or we'll do what we did the other day here now. We're doing a bit of a build-up block again. So we're doing this whole session with a resistance. So we're doing a resisted bound, speed bound. We're doing a resisted straight leg. We're doing a resisted acceleration, and then we'll do a 4th exercise, which is then a normal acceleration without any resistance. And that will cycle will do either 2, 3, or 4 times, depending on where we are in the cycle. Then in, for example, the accumulation phase, we will do, for example, early on, we'll do 2 activation sessions. So we're not doing any real max velocity, but we're still accelerating as fast as we can. So it's speed work, but it's acceleration speed work. So it keeps things alive so we don't lose the speed that we had at the end of last season. Because that's important that, you know, if you finish the season with, let's say, running 10:20, you don't want to be doing something that's going to sort of start you off at sort of at a 1080 level, because you've got nothing to, you know, to gain by training at a 1080 level when you're running 10:20. The idea is that the next season we want to run 10:10, so that we have to, everything has to come up a notch. So that means that to keep that quality alive, we do acceleration work even in the GP phase, and the GP phase usually is followed by a max strength phase. And in that phase, of course, we don't want to be running max velocity, but we'll be running accelerations. So we tie in this newfound max strength with accelerations. That way we can transfer it to the track, and neuromuscular-wise, we're priming the system to be able to generate higher forces and faster. And then from there, we'll move over more and more to, for example, early on, we'll do max velocity with plenty of recovery. We might do 90s where we do a 30-30-30, or we do 60s, 20-20-20. So 20 acceleration, 20 hold, and then 20 lift. So we're just trying to increase the cadence. And then the period before we go to competition is when we start speed endurance. So we'll then start running things like a 120, a 90, and a 60, for example, with 4 or 5 minutes recovery. And depending on if we're running more towards a 200, then we might do two repetition or 2 sets of that with 12, 15 minutes recovery. So the accumulation is then all towards just running accelerations and max velocity wise. And then as we transfer into the season, the max velocity becomes our competition days. And what was max velocity becomes a speed endurance day. And there are 2 different types of speed endurance. You've got a long and a short speed endurance.
Cool. So kind of want to like dive a little bit deeper into this about like I know some of the track coaches, they're gonna use a 3-day cycle or like 4-day cycle to program like what they do no matter on the track or in the weight room. So for like personal experience, like what kind of like situation you're gonna use, like 3-day cycle or like 4-day cycle, or it's just like, or probably like 9-day cycle?
Well, I usually use a 7-day cycle, but we train Monday, Tuesday. So we'll have 2 sessions on Monday, 1 session on Tuesday. We have recovery on Wednesday, and we train Thursday, 2 sessions, Friday 1. Saturday is usually a tempo day, extensive tempo, and then Sunday's rest. So we'll train 2 days, have 1 recovery, have 3 days, have 1 recovery. So I suppose you could say that the big quality of the session of the week is early on. So it's Monday, and as we then, for example, move towards running max velocity, the max velocity will be on Thursdays, as we have a recovery day on Wednesday. So we'll do a sprint activation on the Monday. We'll lift on Monday. Sprint activation, on Monday, and then on Tuesday, we for example, we'll do block starts to tie in with the acceleration the day before, and then we have a recovery, and then on Thursday we'll run max velocity, for example.
Nice. So, this has also come from last conversation we did. So, like you mentioned, you're gonna do some step ups or like um, parallel squat in the weight room, and you also mentioned that you're gonna do probably some lunges. So, how exactly do you like combine this and like periodize this work?
Well, I use, because of the system that I use, I've got a metric in there that's called TPV, which is time to peak velocity. So that I pair that with what I'm trying to accomplish with whoever's in front of me. So if I've got a sprinter in front of me who's running, let's say 10:10, well, then I know that when he's at max velocity, he's probably in the ground around about 85, 90 milliseconds. So for us then to sort of stand and do heavy box squats where it's taking him 300 milliseconds, which is pretty fast with 200, 220 kilos, but it's 3 times slower than what we're actually in the ground, over 3 times slower than what we have to actually do in the ground. It's not going to do me much good. So I need to get out of these max and these lifts that are taking a long time in the ground. So a long time to reach peak velocity and peak power is not something that we're striving. We're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to get to peak power and to peak velocity as quick as possible, because we need to have that to be able to do anything in the ground. So we don't have to sort of stay, forever in the ground, waiting for elasticity and waiting for things to happen and waiting for the ground reaction forces to do most of the work. We want to be able to put force in and then get force out as quick as possible. So therefore, everything that I do and the philosophy behind the way we think is it's geared upon always a progression throughout the year of what the exercise actually delivers in the metrics. For example, at time to peak power, time to peak velocity, for example. What are these figures for each individual exercise? So we're always trying to move forward, and then at different times of the year, we'll, for example, if we need a break, if there's a long break between competitions and maybe some major competitions coming over, and let's say in August, well, then maybe we're going to use parts of July to do a bit of a mini build-up again to sort of refresh the system, let the system recover a little bit more, because we raced quite a few races in June. So we need a bit of a break. So then we sort of go back and do a bit of a mini year, but over maybe 2 weeks' time. So we sort of do a build-up again, and we build up a few qualities. And then we will embark on a new form-topping strategy. And then we'll move these exercises accordingly to what each exercise delivers as far as these metrics that we're chasing, time to peak power and time to peak velocity.
So, do you use force plate to like measure the time to peak power or time to peak velocity?
No, no, I don't anymore, because I did so much work early on when I got my system many years ago. So I've done enough work so I know which exercises are better than other exercises as far as where I should put an exercise in the yearly program. I know where I'm sort of staging them. What I'll do from time to time is I might send the athletes to the biomech lab and say, look, I'd like you to do these tests. And then they'll come back with, they've been on a Vold force plate, which is one of the best in the world. They've got good metrics, good programming system, software system. And we'll get some interesting figures, which is just sort of more or less just to sort of validate what we're already getting out of Muscle Lab, because we're getting the figures that I know. And if we're producing the numbers when it comes to time to peak velocity and the power and peak velocity figures that they should be, that I want them to do in a specific period, as soon as they hit those numbers, then we know that if we were to test them on a force plate, then the numbers would stack up. Nice. So we don't do a great deal of testing with force plates anymore. Since OptoJump came out on the playing field, it's meant that a lot of high performance centers have variant amounts or meters of OptoJump. So in Beijing, for example, we had 30 meters, which meant that, with our sprinters, we could virtually map the whole first 30 meters of their acceleration. Or we could put it in a position where they're coming through those 30 meters at max velocity, and we would get all the contact times and, stride lengths, frequencies, the whole shooting box. So those sort of technology, I think, for us, is more valid than it just standing on a force plate.
Nice. So last time we talked, you mentioned that the acceleration is the king of metrics. So does that mean would you can value like acceleration work more on the track and also acceleration work more in the weight room?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the definition of power, it's force times velocity, and force is mass times acceleration. So there's an element of acceleration that's needed to get things moving. So unless you have acceleration, then you're not going to produce any big force numbers. So, and if you don't have any force, sure, velocity is great, but it's how quickly things happen. That's the big decider. And when you start looking at different sports, for example, if I look at pro hockey, it's not about, for example, in hockey and even in soccer, European football, it's not about how fast these guys can run, because they're not really going to get into positions or situations where their max velocity is going to be the major factor. For a football player, for them to run 30, 40 meters is a long way. And that's where you'll find that they get into a lot of trouble hamstring-wise, because they're not conditioned to run very fast or maximum velocity over 30, 40 meters. And that's why they have, all of a sudden, you'll find a club that has, just a massive amount of hamstring injuries because they've been prepared the wrong way. So there's got to be an element there where you're working max velocity even for footballers, because they do run 30, they can run 30 meters and slightly above without the ball at maximum velocity. So you've got to condition them for that. I would probably call worst case scenario. So, and we all know if you're going sailing, or if you're going to go hiking, or if you're going to climb a mountain, you've got to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And if you're not, you can get yourself in all sorts of trouble. And I think that's one of the big mistakes that some of the football coaches do, that they simply don't look at the velocity part, and then they fall apart and they wonder what's going on. And sometimes they make the fatal mistake of just going into the gym and just trying to get stronger and stronger. So with that said, we've also seen that it's very, very important throughout the year to keep the acceleration part alive, so that the athletes that are dependent on high velocities, like sprinters, long jumpers, you can't stray away too much and get them bogged down by doing things that are not fast and accelerated. It just takes too long to get them back to where they were. And we don't want to there's no use in doing a massive big GP and their general fitness goes way up. Yeah, great, their general fitness goes up, but they lose their acceleration in the first part of the run up. So the rest of their run up, for example, it's all based on rhythm as well. Now, if the first part is sort of fallen apart because we've just been wasting our time doing lots of the wrong thing, then the rhythm and the length of the run up will vary greatly, and therefore technically it will be all over the page. So it doesn't do us any good. And that's, I think, what is something that a lot of coaches make the mistake of sort of doing too much groundwork. You've got to sort of remember that if you've got a 17, 18-year-old, you're not going to do, or 16, 17-year-old, and let's say you've decided that we should be doing sort of building him up until about the age of 19, and then we'll go into high performance. Well, yeah, I both agree and I disagree with that, because you're going to bog him down. And if you sort of see the worst case scenarios of that, you see athletes and coaches they're killing all the speed of an athlete over those years because they're just doing all the wrong things. They're not doing anything with their natural fast sprinting action or their natural elasticity and so forth. They're doing things that actually put a cap on that. So then when it's time to do something and they've got to the stage, they're now ready to start running fast. What? They're ready to run fast after 3 years of GP? Really? You think that works that way? Sorry, it doesn't. So, and this is quite surprising that how many high performance sports actually have this approach, and that this is what we would call in track and field. This is going from long to short, and I don't agree with that approach, nor those with the colleagues that I work with. So we do short to long. So first you've got to learn how to apply force and use it fast, and then you can build endurance. You don't build endurance and then all of a sudden, you don't train like a 10K runner and then decide at age 23, now we're going to start doing speed work. That's going to, and it might work if you're going to run 10,000 meters. Probably won't do that much for you even at that distance, but it definitely won't work if you're doing sprints.
Yeah. So go back to like what you mentioned in when you do things in the weight room or when you do things in track. So like you mentioned that like posture or like the foot placement is more important than like power output, right? So do you think like sprinters should we be teaching sprinters like Olympic lifting?
That's a good question. I think to sort of answer that question in a maybe in a different approach, if you are going to be successful, there is always exceptions to the rule. But if we look at sort of the general population sort of thing, that we're not talking about these absolutely, I don't know what you want to call them, once in a lifetime or once every 20 years or 30 years, Usain Bolts and these sort of guys. They've just got crazy talent and genetics and everything else, and they just do some outstanding things. If we look at reasonably and pretty good talented athletes, then the way that you would work with them, let's say from the age of 13, 14 and upwards, is of extreme importance. So you've got a bunch of what we call fundamental movement patterns. So it's things like you've got to be able to push, pull, hinge, lunge, brace, jump, land. There are 9 different movement patterns. And these can be very, very simple exercises. They're sort of simple. They're slow from the beginning. They become complex and fast as you mature. They go from being medicine ball, or you can have different types of circuits. My wife, for example, is a kindergarten teacher. So she does motor circuits. In other words, coordination circuits, because the kids are 4, 5, 6 years old. So some of them, they can't, for example, jump on one leg because they've never been taught to jump on one leg. So you get them to jump on one leg, they do 2 jumps and they fall over. So you need to get them to understand body positions and learn them more and more difficult things as they progress. So, and what we usually find is, which is interesting, we've had long discussions with this in different groups. Professor Rick Howard from Western University and I did a bunch of stuff together here a couple of years ago during COVID on long-term athletic development. And what seems to be the case, and Randy and I have discussed this at length, and there's, you get athletes who are very, very gifted, and all of a sudden in their technical, let's say, development, there just seems to be this massive big break. All of a sudden it's like all the brakes are on. We just can't get technically, we can't get them to get better technically. Physically, yes, but technically there just seems to be this barrier. And the interesting thing is that when we look at these athletes, we find usually, and this is the interesting thing, they've been specialized very early. So remember I said there was 9 movement patterns. Well, when we test these guys and these girls, we find that they've got 3 or 4, sometimes even less. They have 2, 3 of these movement patterns, which they're very good at, but they've got no idea about the others. They're in fact, they're very mediocre, or they're hopeless at those. So what that means is that their body awareness, their kinetic sense, where they are in the air, there's so many other things that they learn from these other movement patterns. So the lack of these movement patterns inhibits learning at a certain stage. So in the literature that, you know, that's flowing around today with people like Professor Rick Howard and so forth, what we're saying is that build movers first, then we build athletes. And I think that is true from 2 points of view. One, from a technical point of view, and 2, of course, which is probably just as important, I think they go hand in hand, is resilience. In other words, resilient from injuries, because the more of these movement patterns they can acquire, they will also become better movers, and there's a less likelihood that they will get into positions and do things that will, in time, because of the repetitive nature of sports, especially some sports, they will get injured. They will get chronic injuries in areas because they're compensating. Because one of the things that we know about the human body, it is an absolute marvel of a machine at creating compensation patterns. So if something tightens up or something isn't working, you might be jammed up in one hip, one foot can be jammed up from jumping. The body immediately fixes this by moving things, stiffening up things, and changing movement patterns to compensate for what's going on that left takeoff foot, or that right foot, or that right shoulder when you're playing tennis. It will stiffen up and do all sorts of weird and wonderful things to change those movement patterns to enable you to do what you're trying to do, and that will then over time will lead to overuse injuries and other injuries because of these compensatory patterns that your body is doing all on its own.
So you mentioned that there's 9 movement patterns. So can you give us a clue about what is the 9 movement pattern?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Repeat that again.
So you mentioned that there's 9 movement patterns. So can you give us tell us what is the 9 movement pattern?
Well, it's like I said, it's pull, push, hinge. What is it? Hinge, rotate, lunge, squat, jump and land, and rotate. So you've got to learn where, for example, if you're rotating, for example, who rotates? Well, discus throwers rotate, shot putters rotate these days, high jumpers rotate around the bar, so do pole vaulters. there's a lot of things that you do that encompass rotation, landing, how to brace yourself, how to hinge, which means that if you're hinging from the hips, to be able to do snatches and cleans, you've got to be able to hinge. But hinging is also something that you use, for example, when you are throwing the javelin, you brace and you hinge. So there are combinations of movements that you do in different techniques that you need to be able to master. Long jumpers, for example, they brace at takeoff, and then they do different types of rotational movements to counteract what's happening with the upper body so they don't over-rotate and so forth. So they need to be able to have spatial awareness of where they are, so they're not just all of a sudden flapping around with their arms like a windmill after takeoff. And that would sort of defeat the purpose of having a very nice run-up and takeoff if all of a sudden you've got no idea what's happening when you're in the air. So all of these things, for example, the way I, for example, learn very small children how to clean is that you just put a medicine ball in front of them or between their feet. So it's a small ball, doesn't need to be very big. And they simply squat down with straight arms, pick it up, and then they just rotate it. They just bend their elbows and they do a clean. It looks very, very rough, but it actually starts to move in that and get that pattern of movement in, and then all you do is just refine that movement. And in lunges, it's the same thing. But again, if you look at what, for example, I was mentioning what my wife works with, they do a lot of coordination circuits. So they learn to coordinate between left and right sides. For example, bear crawls or crawling. You'd be surprised how many kids at 5, 6 years of age can't crawl. They simply don't understand their crawling action. It's uncoordinated. And it's a very, very, bear crawls are a very, very good way of teaching children nice. Those movement patterns. And they can then be incorporated into more and more difficult expressions of those early movement patterns. So there's a natural progression.
Get it. So kind of want to go back to like you mentioned, like when it comes to acceleration, it's about like pushing back and the posture is more important. So in order to like teach your athlete like where should they place their foot, do you use like wicket drills or like some kind of like coaching cue to help your athletes with this?
It all depends a little bit on what the problem is. We use small mini hurdles, or you guys call them wickets. Wickets for an Australian is cricket. There's three of them in each end of the bowling on the cricket pitch. They're wickets. But in America they call mini hurdles for wickets, which is quite funny from Australia. But never mind. So mini hurdles or wickets are a good way of learning how to keep dorsal flexion. It's also a good way of getting a knee drive, getting into the nice tall position with your hips stacked. And you can, as speed pick up, you can also start pulling the hurdles apart. So you'll start off with hurdles placed closer together at the start, and then as speed picks up and they get from an accelerated position to a max velocity position, they will then will pull the hurdles apart and then try to get the hurdles in a position where they really have to work very, very hard to get everything back down from that forward position. And we use, for example, Randy introduced me to a system which is called an activator belt, which is 6. It's not 6, it's 4. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's 4 rubbers on each side, rubber tubing. So you've got a like a boot that you put over your foot, over your shoe, and it makes the downward movement much more difficult from that position down. And then as you push off, of course, the bands are being stretched, and that means that your foot's coming back very, very quickly. So it speeds up the recovery phase. So you're ready to strike faster. So it speeds up that whole action. And then the downward action, you get resistance, which is an interesting way of doing it. If you don't have a 1080 sprint, then an activator belt is well worth the investment. They're a little bit hard to find these days, but there is a source in China that makes them. I can strongly recommend getting an activator belt. The first time that my athletes used them, they were absolutely wasted, and I think they did something like 3 flights of 12, 15 mini hurdles, and they were absolutely roasted. They were toast because they had to work so hard in the downward phase that they were just tired. I mean, the whole posterior chain is working overtime.
And it also assists the recovery phase, so help it get faster when we need to recover,
yes,
right?
So you've got to work. It speeds up that whole phase, the recovery phase. So it's sort of like it's at first it's a little bit difficult to coordinate. It's interesting watching sprinters, especially sprinters, the first time that they use an activator belt, because everything happens so quick. Once they push off, then that foot just boom, and it's all of a sudden it's up there, it's ready to go again, and they go, oh Jesus, and you can see that it's all sort of uncoordinated and a bit sort of lopsided, and it looks like they're sort of flopping around at the first few times because they really don't know what to do with it. And then once they get the feeling and the timing of what happens, then you can see that they start enjoying it, and it's a very, very interesting tool. Of course, these days with the invention of the 1080 sprint, those type of devices, we can load up and do things differently by the way that you anchor the 1080 to the athlete. If you want to do starts, you can anchor it very, very low. So in other words, down below the center of gravity. So below your belly button height, you'll have a bunch of points up the back. If we want to get, for example, more a horizontal pull, we will get the machine set up on a box that might be 70, 80 centimeters high, so that the line is at the same height as you're coming out of the blocks. So your center of mass is about the same height as the 1080. That way you're getting a strictly horizontal pull and not from down below. You can, for example, with athletes who tend to come up very quickly, you can anchor it very high up. And if they then try to come up even the slightest bit, they get virtually ripped off the ground because the machine is anchored so high up. So it'll just stand them straight up. So it forces them to stay down through the acceleration coming out of the blocks. So you can do some interesting things with some of the new technology that's come out.
Nice. So, last question before I let you go, okay? We discussed about like sprinting. So I know in Hong Kong you train like jumpers. So is there like this is kind of like a big question, but how exactly do you like program your athlete to like jump higher?
Well, it comes back to what I said earlier about the start phase of sprinters. It's not how much force you can put into the ground. It's where you put it in. So in other words, if you're in the wrong positions and you've got massive amounts of force, it's not going to help you. You're simply not going to get down the track fast. So if you have less force, but you can apply it in the right positions and in the right timing, then you're going to get down the track a lot quicker. So it's all about applying force in the right position. So if you're in the wrong positions in track and field, because these events everything that happens in the ground is anywhere between 70 milliseconds and about 300 milliseconds. So we're talking about very, very, very quick time frames where things have got to happen rapidly, and not just once. In some cases, yes, once or twice, depending if it's a throwing event. If it's a cyclic event, in other words, a repetitive cycle, like in sprinting, long jumping, you've got a cyclic event with an acyclic finish, which means you do one long jump, one takeoff. Then things are, happen very, very rapidly. So you've got to prepare athletes for what actually transpires on the track, and that's, I think, is something that we've sort of from time to time we've lost our way a little bit. Some coaches have, at least. We tend to do a lot of general preparation, and we think that that's, the better they are prepared as far as the general preparation. But problem is that general preparation is usually so far away from the real thing that we really don't get much of a help from that general preparation. With that said, general preparation is really, once you get up to the high performance stage, the general preparation is usually only 2-3 weeks maximum. And it's not about general preparation. It is more as a preparation of getting the body ready, because it's had maybe a few weeks off, a month off, where maybe the last week I've asked them to do a few sessions to get things just going again, and then we'll start a GP phase. And it's really just a phase to get joint lubricants going, get their mind switched on to what now we're back in business again. Just awaken the body gradually over 2-3 weeks, bang, and then we get stuck into a max strength phase, and then into a power phase, and those sorts of things. So there isn't sort of like this massive big 2-3 months of slogging away in the gym at general preparation, because that's just going to bog me down.
Cool. That's kind of like all the questions I have for today. So really appreciate for like doing this. So if there's like coaches and therapists are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Well, probably the best place is on Instagram, under Tailwind Squad. We call our group. So on that, I usually this morning or yesterday, I posted some stuff that we did with the 1080, and I also posted one of the high jumpers has unfortunately, she hurt herself last year and had an ACL reconstruction. So I did a baseline test with her with these exercises, which she's come so far in the rehab. So we use a very lightweight, and we could then see that there's still a difference in certain things that she does. In the bounding and the straight leg, there was no difference. But as soon as I asked her to sprint, because of what happens then in the sprint phase and how her hamstring works and so forth, there's a difference. We can quite clearly see on the force and the power curves that the 1080 is generating, that there is still a significant difference between left and right sides. So okay. It's very, very helpful to have, and just to see those type of things that we can sort of track asymmetries. Everybody's got asymmetries, but when we know there's an asymmetry there that is due to the fact that we've had a reconstruction of in this case, an ACL, it's something that we've got to sort of make sure that we can sort of even it out. And then there might still be a discrepancy, because I have not tested her before with the 1080, so I don't know if there was an asymmetrical difference between left and right. But for example, for those who want to sort of dwell into that rabbit hole, if you look at Usain Bolt, he was a very, very predominantly right side. The way he ran, he was very much asymmetrical and had a dominant right side. And a lot of people would say they would have gone in and fixed the faults. Yeah, the guys run 9:58 with a fairly substantial asymmetry. The question is, would he have run 9:58 if he would have been symmetrical? We don't know. Sometimes you don't want to fix faults like that because it'll mess up his technique, because he's running with a rhythm and a way that he generates based upon the fact that he's got that asymmetry. So in fixing that asymmetry, we could in fact mess up his whole timing, and he ends up running slower. So it's not as easy as some people think. Oh, it's just a matter of running fast. Yeah, right. If that was the case, we'd have a lot more people running sub 10 than we have, and there isn't. So it's pretty difficult to do. So you've got to sort of stay at it for a while and have some pretty good talent if you're going to run sub 10.
Love this. Appreciate it, Coach.
No, okay, no problem.